Welcome to Exit Interview. I am your host, Efi Walker. Today, I am joined by my guest, Erin Hill, former Executive Director of ActBlue, a political tech nonprofit that builds online fundraising software for Democratic candidates and progressive nonprofits. Over Erin's 17-year tenure, ActBlue grew from a small startup of a few staffers to a core piece of technology for our democracy, working with presidential campaigns and helping millions of donors raise nearly $11 billion at the time of her departure. Erin's exit story of leaving after a long tenure is one of understanding when it is time to pass the baton, and also what it means to be a role model when you are one of the few women in tech. I'm excited to share her story with you. I am here today with Erin Hill, former Executive Director of ActBlue. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here today, Erin. Thank you for joining us.
I'm so glad and delighted to be here with you, Efi.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. What do we have to know about your childhood to help us understand the leader that you are today?
I was raised a little bit outside of Boston, in Massachusetts, and I was raised into a family where public service was part of the fabric of our family and the work that we did. I grew up, my grandfather was one of like 10. A lot of his siblings had taken roles in kind of our local community life and civic life. So, people were elected to city council. There was a superintendent, and my family was always really involved in what was going on with our community and that public service. I would grow up, I'd be the kid who would be 8 years old, hanging out with my dad on a corner, holding signs, going canvassing for the local candidates that were important to us. And I always liked that part because it was part of my family tradition, to be able to be part in building your community that way, know the people around you. But I was also always really like people. And that's a good way to get to know people and to hear their stories and the things that are challenging and what the community that we all share feels like for them and what their experiences were. And, my mom was also really involved in civic life through kind of her work with kind of being part of our school system and other PTA moms. And when I was pretty young, there was a potential, they were going to use property in our city for a purpose that they were going to dump kind of sludge waste there. And that was not something that they wanted to have happen. And so they were involved with all this activism to really push back on that. And they were successful. And I think from those things, I really tied together at an early age that this thing that was part of my family fabric, meeting people and really advocating for community, you could have all of this positive change as from that. You could, win your local battles. And that always really drove me from a really early age. And so I was always involved in going to campaigns. And when I was in high school and when I was in college, I worked in different kind of offices of elected officials, trying to learn that craft and really trying to learn how I could use, my skills, because I'm kind of a people-oriented person and I was organized. They put me into fundraising pretty early with campaigns, which is what they do when you're a people person and you're kind of organized. I worked for Congressman Joe Moakley in Massachusetts, who was kind of last of one of those like bread and butter Democrats from South Boston. And he was very big. He would say, as long as Mrs. O'Leary is getting her Social Security check this week, that is our most important job, making sure we're advocating for the people in our community. And I was just an intern then, but they were great to me and I got to learn a lot. And so it was kind of something that I was always involved in for a really long period of time, and something I always felt compelled and passionate about, making sure I was advocating for my values and for the people around me and making sure people felt like they had a voice in our democracy.
When did so if you were to go back to 8-year-old Erin, right, what did 8-year-old Erin think she'd be doing when she grew up?
Oh, 8-year-old Erin would probably tell you that she was going to be the president. Because I think, the small elementary school mind only can envision one path towards success and one path towards change. And I think that was the thing that looked like it was, well, that's clearly what you should aspire for. It turns out life is a lot more nuanced and interesting than that. But I always wanted to work in a public service arena and be able to do that. I think my career actually took me in a much more entrepreneurial way than I would have expected to go. And I think that is the kind of thing that an 8-year-old Erin could not have envisioned, but turned out to be really rewarding and something that I had an aptitude and surprising interest for.
So what's interesting to me is that most people that we talk to, like you and I talk to, especially women, would say, I don't know if I would have aspired to be president because I didn't see a model of that. So what was it about your environment and how you grew up, or maybe just who you were at 8, that made you think that was a normal, natural, obvious choice when it's not for so many?
Well, I didn't know it was a realistic choice. I had, a very supportive family, and both my parents, but also the extended family, who never dampened all of my interests and ambitions. They probably should have been at some point, but they were very much supportive of their children dreaming and working hard to be able to do that. I come from very good working middle class stock, where you work hard and you work for your community and you just keep going forward. So they never curbed that ambition or tried to suggest that there were things that I could not do. And so that was probably a very supportive, but maybe an indulgent environment for a precocious 8-year-old. But I really was grateful for that. And you're right, a lot of people do not have that opportunity. But I just kind of moved forward. Like I said, I was doing a lot of this with my family because public service was so ingrained in their life. And so whether I was to reach, whatever, a child will say, oh, I'm going to be, run this or be an astronaut or be president. But making sure that I was working towards making a difference and helping our world to be able to move forward was just something that felt very natural as part of that's what our family did. You support your community, you give back to your community, and you use whatever skills and opportunities you may have to be able to try to advocate for others. And so I think that was just very much ingrained in me from an early age and just felt like the natural progression of what I was interested in.
You mentioned this interest in, even though, the presidency isn't something you've yet chased down.
I don't think that is in my story, but I am very, very excited for us soon to have a woman who will be in that office, and very, very looking forward to that.
Yes. And so, but you did mention that, interestingly enough, like entrepreneurship, right? That sort of startup world, that did catch on for you. There was something that really inspired you. So talk to us about how you went from, an intern in an office, really helping to ensure that, everyday people were getting their benefits and that these local things could be solved for. What part of that journey led you to entrepreneurship? Where'd you get that first taste?
Well, I mean, people talk about politics and public service. It's hard. It's organizing. And that's what entrepreneurship is at its heart. In 2004, I was a volunteer with the finance staff on the Kerry campaign because that was a presidential election year. That was a time of turmoil in our country with the second Bush administration on the cusp. Hurricane Katrina had just happened. We were on the cusp of what would turn out to be a very major financial recession. And we were engaged in all of these wars across the world where America was not behaving or representing the way that I think certainly me and people that I cared about felt like that was where we were going in the right direction. And so I was working on that campaign in 2004. And then after the convention, I got an opportunity to get a paid job and work at the DNC in Washington, D.C., which just seemed very exciting to me. Working, as the most entry-level person. And that was an interesting time to be involved in working on campaigns because we were on the cusp of so much change. So that was the first presidential election after the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, BICRA, got passed, which a lot of people know by the two major Senate sponsors they had, which were John McCain and Russ Feingold. People call it McCain-Feingold. But what that was the most sweeping piece of campaign finance legislation that had happened since Watergate. And that changed the way campaigns and finance shops ran because it did two important things. It got rid of soft money, which used to be this unlimited kind of untracked money that was filtering through party committees and would start at the top and then kind of filter its way down. And it removed that from the political equation and instead had this reliance on contributions coming from individuals. And it started to, index that to inflation. But in the past, that hadn't really been a space where a lot of people had participated, right? I, being an intern and all of those things, I worked all these fundraising events, and you had people who were usually very involved in campaigns and civic lives, people who were involved in their Democratic town committees or their state, political committees, people who were involved in their unions and stuff, or people who were part of this donor class, and they would go to fundraising events or they would have access to things. But it wasn't something where a lot of, everyday people were involved in that fundraising portion of campaigns, mostly because they didn't have to be. And also because it just was not possible kind of technology-wise to envision that. But the other thing that was happening in 2004 was that for the first time, the internet was starting to become a much more common part of our everyday lives. And those things were happening in tangent. And so suddenly it was more possible to reach a bunch of people. It was more possible to take in a bunch of contributions of $5 and not have the kind of paperwork aspect of it be so burdensome because the technology could help you with that part of it. And so that was really the first presidential election in 2004 under these new campaign finance rules, where campaigns were slowly starting to change, where you had to reach out to get more donors because you didn't have the soft money anymore. And campaigns did not get less expensive. They were getting more expensive. So in order to be able to run a competitive campaign and really get your issues out there, you needed to invite more people into this fundraising portion than had ever happened before. And suddenly you have these broadcast mechanisms through technology and these intake mechanisms through technology at the same time that computers are starting to become part of people's homes and things. And you had that all happening at the same time. And so my job at the DNC was basically trying to help figure out how to be able to sustain this volume, because all of a sudden you had all these more contributions coming in and you didn't have systems that were set up to be able to make that happen, especially because political contributions, they're very high information transactions because you need to verify names and citizenship and occupation and employer. And you need to be able to file those publicly with all of the reporting agencies. And so that's where technology could help, but we were still learning those systems. And so part of my job was trying to, handle this volume and try to keep things moving. And so I was opening up envelopes of, little old ladies who were sending in $5 checks and saying, this is a significant part of my Social Security this month. I have never donated to a political campaign before. I didn't know I could, but this is too important. I need to do this for my family. Or students who are saying, this is going to be my world and this is not the country I want to live in. And so here's the money I've saved up to be able to do that. And I was incredibly moved and thrilled by what this could mean as a possibility for what came forward. And so just kind of very lucky to be at the right place at the right time and be able to see that. And so 2004 was one of those elections where it did not go our way. We lost everything on that election. And it took a little while for me to figure out where I wanted to be in the political world after that. I applied to so many jobs and I couldn't quite figure out what was going to be the right fit for me. Was it working somewhere on Capitol Hill, working on legislation? Was it working, on campaigns again? And a former colleague of mine at the DNC introduced me to the founders of ActBlue and said, I've met these people and I was here in Boston. I was back home and they said, they're in your neighborhood. And I think they're doing something interesting and they need help. And that was it. I saw the possibility of what they were building and was immediately really excited about doing what I could to help it be successful. But it was also still like a startup. There were only, I was the fourth person that got hired to do that work. We had absolutely no money. but they had already done this in 2004. This was 2005, and they had had success. They had helped people raise $1 million, which was kind of amazing. And they were technologists. They were coming from that part of the world. I was coming from campaigns, and I knew if I were on a campaign, this would be very valuable to me, because you're building software I can't get myself on a campaign. And I, started answering questions from people who were writing in, started organizing the people I knew in the campaign world, and was able to kind of follow this trajectory, which was amazing. Again, very fortunate to be kind of at the right place at the right time, at this time when our politics were changing, because the culture was changing, because the law had changed, and that had changed the incentives, and where technology was starting to change. So 2005, that is a time before iPhones, which seems ancient at this point, but everything was just starting to kind of take a hold. And that was a place where we could be together. And so in those early days, I think it looked dubious whether or not that was going to come together. My dad would be like, "Oh, you're such a smart girl, go to law school." But I really always believed that there was something here, and that it was an interesting question, that if you could make it very easy and secure for people to make contributions and for people to participate in our politics, and if we could build this technology that could scale, that could make it easy for campaigns and then eventually nonprofits to be able to connect with those communities, what does that mean? Does that mean more people participate in our politics? Does that mean more people get a voice in who leads them? Does that mean new candidates will be able to find their way to success and be able to have their voices raised? Does that mean that we're all more aware of what's happening around us, and our politics will have to be then more receptive to that? And then, how do you do that? How do you build a business around this prospect? How do you grow from something that's very small to being able to be something big? And those were really interesting questions to me. And part of the reason I stayed at ActBlue for such a long time, and it was the best job I could have had when I was there, is that those remained the animating principles through the entire tenure. All about how to make it possible for more people to have a voice. And I can't imagine getting to do better work. I got to help so many other people make change, which is such a humbling and grateful thing for me to get to do.
One of the things that I'm struck by as I'm listening to you is your ability to kind of sit at the balcony level, right? And understand the macro dynamics that are at play, this sort of situate the context and the environment and sort of the window of opportunity, while also then identifying these big questions that have an impact on all of us, right, in our lives, in our democracy. And also the third thing that's standing out for me is the connected pieces, right? I worked here, and then that person connected me to here, and then this is the opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if for our listeners, if you could, I know we're going to spend some time diving into ActBlue, but just to zoom out a little bit and just say, like, where does this skill come from for you? Like, your ability to sort of zoom out, understand like the broader context, identify the core questions that need to be answered. Let's just take those two. Like, where did you hone that skill? Because that's sort of the like, oh, I'm going to go to law school and I'm going to become, it's like, well, I don't need law school, Dad. I've got these skills. So where did you hone that, what I would say is a pretty uncommon gift?
Oh, well, that's very flattering. It didn't feel like I was in the balcony. It felt like I was in the trenches, through most of those experiences. And I think, obviously the work that I was doing at ActBlue was involved in the public service arena, involved in politics, working with nonprofits. But I think the story and the work that ended up happening there is really applicable to all sorts of industries. It was strategy, finding an opportunity, and then it turns out it was very entrepreneurial. It was building this startup and being part of this and seeing it grow to something that became this kind of behemoth at the end of the day. And that is not a skill that I think I would have, certainly 8-year-old Erin would not have said, like, would seem risky to do something where we don't know if we're going to get paid. That seems scary. But ended up for me being one of the more gratifying and interesting parts of the work. I certainly didn't plan to stay at any job for 17 years. That is anathema in all modern careers. Nobody stays in that. And I came from politics where you only worked as long as there was an election. People were switching jobs, every 6 months. But it was never the same job for that 17 years. It was always something that I think in modern life, it's rare to be able to work at something that you find an interesting intellectual problem and that you find that you can be curious and learn new things about and discover new aptitudes as part of, but that is actually making a change in other people's lives. And so that was just this rare gift to be part of that. But we were trying to do something new at a time where certainly the tech startup world was starting to burgeon and people were learning and telling those stories and people were starting to kind of experiment and hear about different things. But politics, the stakes are always so high, right? When you're running a campaign, it's usually most campaigns are, a husband, a wife, a neighbor over a kitchen table. And the resource that they don't have the most is time. And what they're already doing something that is such an amazing gift to our society, saying, I'm going to stand up for my community. I'm going to give my time and my, sacrifice of my personhood and my lifestyle because I believe in something bigger. And then the stakes always feel so high for that. So trying to get folks to then adapt to a new way of doing that work, of talking to people through the internet, of trusting other folks is a huge ask. And I was always very cognizant of that because I came from that world. I understood what was bringing people to that table and the things that were pulling at their time. And so in those early days, I had to spend a lot of time telling that story about how our world was changing, telling that story about how what they were doing, we weren't going to change. I think people hear technology and they'd be like, oh, what's new in technology? Nothing is new in fundraising. Fundraising is always the same as it's always been. You have to make a passionate, specific ask to someone. And it's an invitation. You're asking someone to be part of something that you're building. And it is that sacred connection that is always going to make something sing. Technology can just help you do it faster, help you do it larger, help you reach more people. And so in those early days of ActBlue, I would have to convince people they should have a website. I would have to talk people through things like, you have that computer in the corner. Okay, we're going to turn it on. And then really talk about what could be practical for their lives. So how this could make their world easy and not feel like something else that was grabbing at time they already didn't have. And so, talking to them about the actions and the organizing they were already doing and trying to get them to see that this was an investment in longer term. And so for a long time, we used to talk in those early days of ActBlue about infrastructure. Essentially, that's what ActBlue ended up being. We ended up being this large infrastructure across the country to make it possible for more people to connect. And in order to do that, we had to build the highways. We had to build the roads. And that is organizing. That's relationships, working one-on-one with people. And so I think in those early days, it's telling that story. It's figuring out what people actually need and how to be related to them. And so I think that is a very political organizing story, but I think it's also that entrepreneurial startup story. Where is there a hole? And how can that fit into somebody's lives? How can that be meaningful? And that is what we ended up doing. But it was always a little tricky in those early days because we were kind of a weird animal. We weren't exactly old school, like we weren't a political party. We weren't, a political action committee. We didn't operate like a political action committee. We had all these different legal statuses. And we weren't, the kind of business where an investor was going to be able to, buy stock in us. We were a nonprofit. And so I think we had to spend a lot of time really thinking about where we lived in between those things. And, at the end of the day, I think strategy, right, comes from that public service background. It comes from that community organizing. It's organizing. It's figuring out the problem, figuring out your other stakeholders, figuring out that story, and then doggedly working and seeing what works.
Yeah. And that's what comes through. And it sounds like you'd had opportunities before, right, to be able to see it in action and to practice it and to live it. And in those early years, that's also what you had to apply those organizing principles, and be able to tell that story in a way that was persuasive and convincing to people who didn't kind of get, like a lot of startups, like, what is this thing, right? And so that's really powerful. So if you were to break ActBlue, when you join, your employee number 4, and maybe this is like the early chapter, what were some of if you could think of like one of the most significant highs of the early chapter, what comes up for you? And then I'd also love to know, like, what was like one of the biggest challenges in those early years?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest challenge in those early years was trying to figure out how to sustain it, because we knew what we were doing was useful, but we were building technology, which is expensive, especially because we were moving money over the internet. You don't cut corners on that. We knew from that really early stage that we had to be flawless in that execution, because we were trying to build trust with folks. We were trying to say that this is a safe way to practice in our democracy. We're going to make this easy for you and keep you secure, so you don't have to worry about that. So you can make this transaction just like you would buy a book, but it wasn't consumer behavior wasn't as common as it is now. Again, we didn't have iPhones yet. We didn't have computers in our pockets. And so all of this was kind of burgeoning. But what was really exciting about it is because it wasn't already part of the organizing framework, there was this entire community of folks who are working on campaigns, folks who are working on different issue-based organizing, and who were starting to become digital strategists, who were starting to experiment with this time without a lot of expectations in those early days. And so, you'd get people who'd be like, the digital team, they'd be in a basement, back closet somewhere, which meant that it was safe to try things, and that there was an ability to really experiment and see if things could work without having to be able to, because people didn't expect it to produce anything. And so that, I think, was really exciting, because it was exciting to help other people be creative. It was exciting to help other people really be able to advance the dial on things that they were passionate for, campaigns, causes that they wanted to make a difference. And they saw this as a way of connecting and new people. It was exciting to see donors feel empowered by the fact that they're making these contributions and starting to give us that feedback, saying things like, oh, I'm important. I helped elect that candidate. They work for me now. And it's like, yeah, they do. They always did, but now they do. And being able to really be part of that transaction, see brand new candidates who were running at this time of great change in our country in 2006, leading up to President Obama's historic election in 2008, seeing new voices put themselves out there and be able to create community and not have to have come, not only to come from the pool of folks who were already part of the donor class, who already had access to kind of that wealth to be able to build competitive campaigns. And in those early days, I think people would talk about the fundraising reporters, campaign brethren would talk about the fundraising as like, oh, this nice little supplement. And I always believed, and I think we always believed in those early days at ActBlue, that this could be the show. This could be how our democracy works. Our democracy should be everybody participating. I mean, you're going to go buy a coffee for $5. Imagine if you invested that $5 in the future of our country. What would that mean to you? What would that mean to who could run for office? And what would that mean to your relationship? We're Americans. We value what we buy. So what would it mean if I felt like I had that investment? And suddenly technology made that possible. And that always seemed really exciting. And that, the 2005, 2006 election cycle, we were trying to help folks raise $10 million through our platform. So 2004, people had raised $1 million. 2005, 2006, trying to help people raise $10 million. And, the way elections work in those days, fundraising used to be really cyclical. So it would kind of go on this hockey stick graph from like when the last election happened to election day, and most of the money would come in at the end. So we knew we were organizing folks. We thought we were having good conversations. We thought people were getting excited, but we didn't know until all of that action happened right at the end, and folks ended up raising $16 million through us, which was more than we had tried to do. And I think all of these early and exciting kind of monikers and like markers to help us know that like this is something that's useful. This is something that could be really important. And so being able to be part of that growth and see it up front and just be working in the trenches every day, and then be able to see these results and see the way that people were responding to that, campaigns, new people who were running for office and then suddenly became elected officials because they could use our tools and do their work and grow their communities. Seeing those digital strategists be creative and try new ways to engage and connect with folks. And now all that is norm in our politics. This is how we work. And that trajectory was really exciting and gratifying and humbling to be a part of.
At what point did you realize that you needed to move into company building, right? So you're getting this, there's all this indicia that, okay, we're going to be sustainable. We can figure, we're doing it. And now this is an operation. Like, we probably need to build like a company, right? I mean, 4 employees is probably not, right? So when did you realize that you were going to shift to company building?
So when we were a few years in, after the 2008 election, obviously Democrats won, President Obama was in office, hope and change. It was a very exciting time to be there. But we as an organization, we had helped people raise tens of millions of dollars. So, about $60 million, I think, at that point. But we were having a hard time keeping our lights on because we were this weird animal where, I think in the early days, it wasn't clear how we were going to be able to find a model that would be sustainable for us. Were we a tech company? How do we pay for the tech? Would people invest in that? Would that work? Could we, have a tech company help us out and then take other clients? Could we be something else? And we were ActBlue, and the work that we were doing was just growing at such a pace, and we couldn't quite figure out that whole mix. And so that ended up being a really galvanizing point for us. We had to we lost some folks who were part of the team. We had to figure out how that all worked. I became the executive director at that point in 2009. I think because I was like the person who had been standing there the longest and didn't look like I could screw it up at that point. And that was hard because I didn't expect to be in charge. And we were in trouble and not clear how we were going to get through that. And what we ended up doing was doubling down on what was working. And we doubled down on our mission. We were like, nope, actually, we're part of the political organization. We're a nonprofit. And so we, our general counsel was like, actually, this is how we should structure ourselves. And we had to figure it out and go through that kind of galvanizing moment and really align the whole organization around the work that we were doing. And we really doubled down on, we are offering this infrastructure. ActBlue never, we weren't software that you bought. Campaigns didn't sign up to work for us. They could use our software. And if they did, people could leave contributions to help support the work that we were doing. And that is a risky, weird model, but we wanted to really help people be able to connect and build these communities of small dollar donors. We wanted small dollar donors to be able to connect with the causes that you care about. And to do that, we had to be that highway to be able to do that. And so we really doubled down on if we're going to do that, then we better work and we better be better than anything that they can build for themselves. Because at the end of the day, if you're asking someone to take the leap and say, yes, I connect with you, candidate X. I believe in what you're doing. I am going to give you, first of all, my time, which is already such a generous ask from anyone. And I'm going to give you X dollars of my hard-earned income. Then that transaction needs to be as easy as possible because you have already done the hard part, which is those folks have made a connection. And so it's our job to make that happen. And so we really doubled down on what it was we needed to deliver to our community and what those expectations are. And then we said, well, test us against other platforms. We're going to be the best. We have to be the best. And if we're not, if we are, then we'll keep doing this work because it will support us. And if we're not, then we did not fulfill our mission and we'll go do something else. And that clarity was scary and hard and absolutely transformative because that just centered us on what we needed to be, what the role we were going to play in helping all of these folks do their work and be able to connect with each other. And it meant that we really focused in on where we were going. And so in the early stages, what we needed first was that organizational development. We needed that strategy. And then we needed to bring new people into the work that we were doing. And to do that, they have expectations. You need to have a workplace, and that needs to have rules. And so we had to figure that out over the time and make sure that we were being values focused in all of that. I'm sure we could have grown faster during those earlier days if we did things like not give all of our folks healthcare, if we did things like not pay interns and stuff, but that is not our values. And so we never did things like that. We figured out what else we had to sacrifice. Maybe we grew a little slower, but we grew in ways that felt true to the environment that we were working in too, and be able to, build our business. So 2009, 2010, those midterm elections during Obama's first, not a great auspicious time for Democrats, but we survived and we figured out how to get through that organizationally. And we were growing again with all of these digital folks who were doing this work. And I think that alignment felt like we figured it out. And from there on, I think the next decade of the work that I did was figuring out how to scale and be able to really handle that roller coaster, because we started then doubling our volume that people were raising through our platform. Elections work in these 2-year cycles. The federal elections happen on the even years, and then you have the years before that when people grow. And so every election cycle for 10 years, we were doubling our volume. And the numbers started getting very big, to the point where in 2016, we crossed $1 billion raised via our platform. We were being used by presidential candidates at that point. And when I left at the beginning of 2023, the platform had raised a little under $11 billion through us. And so then that becomes this story of entrepreneurial and scaling. How do you keep up with that when it felt like we were racing to keep up with that kind of need and that kind of escalation the entire time?
Mm. So let's go back to that sort of, okay, Erin takes on executive director mantle. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of ways, you aspired to be president, to run a country. You are now running an organization. You're running a company. How did you understand that moment of, we have to figure out what we stand for. We have to figure out what our business model is. We have to be clear about what it is we're trying to do. How did you figure that out? I hear you saying a lot of we, which I appreciate. And also, you're now the leader, right? You're the executive director. How did you decide and understand that was what was necessary, and then do it?
Mm-hmm. Well, one, I cared very much about us realizing the promise of what I thought we could be building. When we hit $1 billion, a colleague said, when did you think that this was going to work? Immediately. I wanted to work there from that early stage. When I came across the project, I was like, nope, this is what I'm going to do. This is where I belong. This is that combination of the things that I've been learning over my world, connecting with people, helping them navigate their universe and feel empowered, and being able to scale it. And so I'm going to do my work to try to help this happen. And so it would have been a tremendous shame had it not been able to continue, because I think there was so much promise in what it could do for our country and for our democracy, and how it could help people to feel like they had a voice in it. So I felt that drive to be able to make that happen. And I use we because I prefer that leadership style. You connected earlier that, folks who I'd worked with before referred me to other jobs and things like that. I've been very fortunate. People have, people have made connections for me through my career. People have given me opportunity. I ended up with jobs, especially when I was younger and an intern, that I had no business doing. People are like, oh, by the way, you're going to run this department over the summer. You okay with that? And I'm like, I don't know, I'll figure it out. All of that was tremendous opportunity that people were able to be like, okay, let's see what she can do and see where we can rise. And so as a manager, I believe in giving opportunity to other folks and being part of those conversations. And I think as people could talk, people who come from more traditional tech startups would say, it's really important in those early stages that you're sharing with people and you're telling that story and that you're invested in the we, because that is hard. It is hard to try to figure out how to bring that through. It is hard to bring change. Our success was in no way guaranteed. And, we had a few dicey months there where never missed payroll, but wasn't sure that was going to be there. And so having people who believed in that was really important. And that, telling the story and having others on the team be able to tell our story because they felt part of that story was always really part of it. And so that, I think, in that moment I felt pulled in both directions because I felt like I wanted to make sure all these folks understood that I was in the trenches with them. We were in the trenches together and we were working on this, but I also felt tremendous responsibility. I wasn't going to fail for them. If we had to make sacrifice, I was going to make the sacrifice. Leadership beats last on all of those things. And so I worked real hard all of the time to try to figure that out. Because I wanted to be able to deliver for the people on my team and for the people who were using our platform. And so I think, and I wanted them to feel like the organization's success was partly their success. I couldn't do all of the things by myself. And, I think it comes from that organizing background. Unfortunately, I think the campaign world has improved on this point, but a campaign, when you're a volunteer on a campaign, people are giving up their time and their effort to be part of something bigger. And so that was the world that I came from. That is how I knew to build that community. And so I think that was just kind of what my leadership style looked like at that point.
Yeah. And so you talked about this period of, the next, decade or so, right? And really figuring out scale. How did you, and your point around, I couldn't do this all by myself. I'm going to need a team. I'm going to need a pretty significant team. And they're going to need to do things that I can't possibly do as one individual. How did you go about figuring out how to build your executive team? How did you figure out who you needed? How did you do that?
I think in different ways at different phases. I think early on, I was looking for collaborators, folks who wanted to be part of the work that we were doing because we were building something. And I think that was the opportunity, right? We were this weird little ragtag thing for a while, convincing people to come and join us. They did it because they wanted to be part of what we were building and believe in that. And so the mission part was always really important and it was always close to my heart. And so I think I like to be around smart people. I'm smarter when I get to talk with smart people and be able to bounce ideas. I'm an extemporaneous thinker. I'm kind of chatty. And so I liked having an environment where you could do that. And that was great during those kind of figuring it out days. As we got bigger, though, we started to need different things because suddenly we were building, at one point, I did all of the jobs at ActBlue, not the coding. I learned a lot about technology and, essentially ran a technology company for, a decade. But I'm not a developer. But I did all of these roles and then they became departments and whole groups of people doing that. And as we got bigger and we started moving billions with a B of dollars and started working with, tens of millions of donors who were depending on us and presidential campaigns who were depending on us and local school board races and on all of these cataclysmic and really important moments in our democracy, we needed experts in those different fields. So we needed to recruit people who, come from financial backgrounds where they are very comfortable working with billions of dollars. We needed technologists who understand what it is to work on a really high availability platform because we couldn't fall over and we didn't know when a big moment was going to happen. And we needed somebody who could build at that kind of scale. We needed experts in all of these places. And so then it became about figuring out how to find people from their industries and be able to pull them into the work that we were doing. And how to manage that culture shift of both having people who come with different professional expectations into our, little band of do-gooders, but also of trying to figure out, how they would want to be part of that. What is our value proposition to them? And so I think it evolved over those times as the organization scaled and our needs became a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. What most surprised you about staffing up? right? I mean, clearly you experienced this in campaigns. You experienced this when the company was smaller. But as you all began, you were really in that growth stretch. What sort of surprised you about what people did need and the changing expectations? What surprised you?
I think a lot of classic scaling problem is figuring out how to navigate it when I couldn't touch it all anymore. I felt a strong responsibility to the team that I was building on, and came from a discipline where people led by example. And I worked very hard to try to lead by example, but that does not scale when you have managers across the board. And so that was, I think, a transition that was challenging at different points. And it was hard, especially as we were growing. It took a while before we didn't feel resource constrained. We were resource constrained for a really, really long time. And so being able to invest in what we needed internally for the team was sometimes a hard choice to make, when you need to deliver for your users, because the election is 2 months away. But your team really needs a very strong HR department and be able to build that out robustly. And so I think, some of those decisions, they were hard in the moment to think about what to prioritize. I don't think I built internally enough early on because we were very small and close knit, and then we weren't. And it is one thing to go through the task of filling those positions and creating those jobs, but running something that's at large requires its own kind of internal structure, its own organizational development, and its own, I think, managerial ethos. And so much of this had felt natural to me. I was just doing the next thing, and the next thing. And, as our conversation has revealed, I didn't realize these were skills I had. I didn't realize I was strategizing the entire time. I didn't realize all of those things. And so I think once we got bigger, being able to pull those pieces out and then try to really think about, okay, well, what is our philosophy? How do we bring this up to other folks? Is something that was an interesting challenge as we scaled, and something I think I came to too late, which I think is a classic problem for any kind of organization that is scaling along that way.
What were some of the hardest moments? I mean, you mentioned some of those tensions, right? And there's always those trade-offs, like if I only have $1, like where am I going to put it? Right.
Yeah.
What were some of the harder moments of scale for you? Yeah. What were some of the harder moments?
Being able, I think these are classic organizational structure moments, being able to go deep enough into the different kinds of departments and expertise that you needed. We ended up having folks who worked with our campaigns and organizations, folks who worked with our donors, folks who worked on our legal team, folks who worked on moving the money, folks who worked on all of the technology. And that was both like building the tools that people were using to keeping up the platform and the software. And we really needed experts in all of those places. And I was hiring people who were coming to be part of this work from all sorts of different industries, people who had lots of opportunities and very important jobs, but felt passionate about the work that we were doing and tried to earn their trust by giving them space to be able to hire the teams and the experts that they would need to be able to do that. And that was very necessary to meet those moments. I think, when the pandemic happened and everybody got dispersed and you also got to different places, and that just put strain on our society and our world in lots of ways. I think I had neglected how important it was to bring everybody also together, to be able to have all of these different departments and have us also be part of that same team at the same time. And what I had been doing was I was spinning all the plates. I was trying to be that core in the middle, which is, again, very classic scaling problem. I felt very strong. I wanted to be responsible for everyone. And I wanted to be able to deliver for these folks. And we needed to keep up with what was happening so quickly, because I can't stop the election. You can't, if you're a business, you shouldn't miss a deliverable or a deadline. But if you do, you sometimes adjust to that. But the election was coming, whether we were planning for it or not. And that has real consequences and real stakes. We had to grow so fast after the election in 2016 to get to where we were going to need to be to execute in 2020. And we did. We were able to hit all of those things despite all of the curveballs that came. But that meant my last 2 years, I spent a lot of time in the organization trying to figure out how to put us all back together, trying to figure out what that central conversation would be, trying to invest in kind of that internal structure if I couldn't touch all of the things anymore. And, in hindsight, it would have been great to do that a lot earlier across the process. I think that would have been helpful. But when you're working with those resources and trying to figure out what comes from what, in the moment, it's sometimes hard to figure that out.
Yeah. How did you build a community of peers during these tough leadership challenges and moments?
I wish I did more. I think we were in Boston, which was great. I liked, being a little bit away from things, but a lot of folks who worked in our industry were in Washington, D.C. So it just meant we weren't necessarily physically there. We didn't have a lot of resources in those early days, and we were so busy. And so I really prioritized running the organization versus me getting out there and being able to see all of the people and be able to build all those relationships. And so we had lots of folks who used our tools, who worked with us, who gave us great input, who we got to help be creative, which was great. But and at that point, originally, there kind of weren't a lot of women in my space. There are a lot more now, which is great. But I didn't have as much of a peer network as I would have liked to. Certainly towards the end of my tenure, I was building more of that, and people were really generous with their time and sharing their stories across the board. But I would recommend that to other people who are growing organizations, because especially as we got bigger, it just felt like I think leadership can from other folks. It felt isolating because as we got bigger and my leaders had their own leadership and work to do, we weren't collaborators in that same way anymore. We shouldn't be. We were something different. And at that point, when I realized it would be great to have a stronger peer network, it was tougher to find time to be able to do that. And so I was working towards that towards the end of my tenure. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, which just made it harder for everybody to be able to connect with everybody else.
And is this something one of the things I wonder is I'm pressing on this peer leadership, this peer network piece, because what I've seen again and again is that even outside of industry, just like the leadership challenges, the moves, different industry, but there's so much of it's the same, right? Like even if it's in a different sector, et cetera. And in some ways it can actually feel safer to have that group. Those are not in your industry, right? So,
Absolutely.
there's some distance and perspective that can be really healthy. And I'm curious, since you've had time to sort of, step away and sort of reflect, what do you think having that network would have meant for you?
I think one, it's really important to talk about things that are tough and things that folks tried and didn't work out and then tried something else across the board. But I think particularly in that growth stage, there's so much pressure for everything to be delivered all the time. The folks we were working with, in the political industry, they were depending on us. And so I felt very responsible to make sure we were delivering for them across the board. Towards the end of my tenure, I started working my own management, started working on that own relationship. I, got a management coach, started talking to folks about that. And I think it's just always very helpful to be able to really take a step back and look at my problems from those strategic kind of spaces to be like, no, this is what happens when things get bigger. This is what happens at this other stage. And so I learned a lot about organizational development in the last 5 to 7 years. And that was really helpful. And I think that that's, having networks where people talk about that, I think is really useful. I think a lot of that exists now. And I hear from a lot of folks who are connected to different networks where people are talking about that. And I think that seems really important for especially folks at that growth stage. I think also I think it's always comforting to know you're not alone and that, none of these I was very aware that all of these challenges they were not unique. They were how these challenges go. I think it would have been useful to be able to hear that from other folks. A lot of new organizations came into the political activist area and the progressive area after the 2016 election. And one thing that I think I was gratified by, and also for me was a sign of ActBlue's long-term success. When we started in 2004 and 2005, there weren't a lot of other things. We were this weird animal. People are like, well, that's weird. We'll see what happens with that. And so we kind of just had to flop around by ourselves. A lot of the folks who had organizations at that time didn't persist. Things didn't work out. Things didn't get past those early stages. People left that industry to go into other industries, which happens all of the time. And in 2016, you had another one of those moments of change where lots of people were feeling compelled to enter the arena and to help build tools to help Americans figure out how to interact with our democracy, figure out what to do at that point in time. And at that point, ActBlue was able to be the infrastructure we set out to be. A lot of those organizations didn't need to figure out their funding sources immediately because they could raise small dollar contributions through ActBlue, and they could have the people who were asking for their services helping to fund what they were building in real time in that way. And a bunch of organizations, and I was proud to help when people needed it, to just offer some a mentorship of yep, been here. It's exciting that you're all building this, and be able to share those stories. And so I was grateful for the opportunity that ActBlue could go from that, burgeoning thing to becoming something that helps other things become possible, and to be somebody who could help support kind of the next generation of organizers who are coming up during that period of time, and just hopefully be able to offer some war stories from the past.
Yeah. Were you aware? So there's a classic sort of trope of, what it means to run a tech company. Yep. What it's like. It's foosball, it's endless kegs, and it's free, all the things, and you're, around all the things. We know.
We had a ping pong table.
Okay, you did. Okay. I was not aware of this, but so there's no shade is being thrown. No shots are being fired. But as you thought about the kind of company you wanted to run, the kind of culture you wanted to build, how did you think about how you wanted to shape the tech company you were running, and how did other models or other pictures of what it meant to run a tech company, how did those things influence you or not?
Well, part of that is not just about what I wanted the organization to be, but what were going to be the expectations of people who are going to come to work for us, and the people who we needed to recruit, especially on the tech side. What were they being offered at other places? What was the work environment that they were coming from? How to be able to match that and be able to bring that in. It was really important that we could, pay competitively to our staff across the board. I mean, I think that that's just our good progressive values, but also we were doing something that was important. And I think that oftentimes in the nonprofit sector, there's this expectation of sacrifice, that in order to do good, you need to be on your hands and knees as a martyr somewhere. And I understand that. I, again, came from this culture of public service that came from that working middle class, background. And so I am, in those early days, we did sacrifice because that's what happened in a startup. We didn't have any money and didn't have those things. But I felt very strongly that that is not a way to lead, and that we were building something that was serious, that we were asking people to already take the leap in a new way of interacting with our democracy. And let's face it, politics does not have the greatest reputation. And people are already distrustful, understandably so. And so our stuff had to be impeccable. Our technology had to work. We had to be secure. We had to be doing everything by the rules. We filed all of our operations with all of these different regulatory bodies where you could see everything that was happening all the time. That transparency and that ability to be able to deliver was really important to being able to build this faith that this is an action I can and should take. And so we had extremely high standards. And to do that, you needed people who had great skills, who could come on in and build that. And so in those early days, we were really hiring for special skills of people who could handle volume in that way. And trying to figure out how to be what kind of environment what makes us competitive. Because we're not offering stock. And we're, especially in the mid 2010s, right, we're competing with very lucrative financial offers of people working in the technology spaces. And then for the people who are working on the advocacy and the campaign, the organizing side of things, we knew that institutional knowledge was really important to what we were building. And that is not something that happens a lot in politics, right? People get priced out of, there's a lot of it's better now, a lot of entry-level pay, a lot of people not getting benefits, a lot of expectation if you're going to be on a campaign that you're not going to be able to take a break. You're not going to be able to get healthcare because you have to sacrifice for this cause. And I think the whole political environment has been doing better, both because I think we've been held accountable for our values as we should. And I think our workers have organized in ways where they're advocating better for them. I believe in that. So that's great. But also because it just makes more sense. You can't build a long-term movement. You don't change the country in one election. You don't change the country in 1 year. This is the work of decades. And if you want to do that, people need to be able to build sustainable long-term careers in this work. And to do that, you have to grow with the folks. So the folks who came on board when we were in that young, scrappy stage, I also was fortunate I got to be a witness to their life. They grew up, they got married, they had kids, they got divorced, they had more kids, they bought houses. And so it was really important that we could also be an environment that grew with that. So the ping pong table felt like an important marker to have, at one point, because that's what people were doing across the board. And we wanted to be able to feel like we fit in with that. Having an excellent parental leave plan was a really important part at another point in our life. And so I think it was about trying to find that. It was always that negotiation of all those balances, right? What is true to our values as an organization and to the environment that we work in? Also, it's just good business. If you can keep people on, you're building institutional knowledge, you're building trust, you're building expertise. So how do we grow with people's careers? How do we create career paths, which is a whole nother part of organizational development, which was a lot for me to learn and tricky, but so important. And then also, how do we look competitive in the industry that we're in? And also, how do we not have fun? It was always really important to me that there was personality in our work. Our organizational tone for a long time during those early years was decidedly friendly and approachable. I got teased a lot because I spent a decade telling people I was happy to help, ! Because again, you were asking people to trust in something that was a new process and something that they were understandably wary. We were moving political contributions over the internet. People understandably had caution about that. And if they had a bad experience, it's not like they might not ever come back to our platform. They might not participate in democracy again. And so we cannot let that happen. And so being able to have that tone and be approachable was important for our organizational brand. It's important for my leadership style. I wanted to be approachable and open to hearing from folks. And honestly, we were doing such serious work that I like just being a little goofy. I like just being a little weird because you have to balance that out. You have to have some fun and some joy in the work that you're doing in order to sustain, this work that has such really serious implications.
Mm. One of the things I'm struck by is your deep sense of responsibility for essentially anything that you're engaged in, right? So whether it's I'm 8-year-old Erin and I am going to be door knocking and canvassing with my family, or I'm an intern and we need to make sure that Mrs. Jackson and the policies that we're pushing forward ensure that she gets her benefits, or if I'm ensuring that, yes, it's going to be difficult as a team internally, but we have to make sure this goes well because there are people who are counting on us. There are first-time donors who are coming into the fold, and we can't disappoint them. This has to be seamless. Or I'm building a company, and what I'm offering needs to make sense for the people who are coming on board because we can't afford not to have the right people in each of these roles. Yes, it's the right thing to do, but I have to make sure that I get this right for the sake of the company and our mission. And so I'm curious, for folks who oftentimes feel such a deep and clear sense of responsibility, there can also sometimes be a challenge of, how do I keep something for myself, right? How do I hold a part of my identity that's just me, that it's different from the job that I have or the responsibility that I have to others? How were you able to grapple with that tension?
Not well. not great, which I think is that classic, again, these are not original problems, which kills me. I love to be original. But I think, and in particular, it was challenging because we were moving so fast for so long. And that just required so much drive. And so I think that that's the challenge I have with being an ambitious person. There's always a mountain. There's always another election. It's always really important. And so being able to be able to move forward is really important. And, I think like lots of folks, that catches up with you at some point. The pandemic was a difficult time for everyone. And we were engaged in very heavily in the 2020 presidential election. In, the whole social upheaval around Black Lives Matter that was happening, a lot of those groups were raising funds via our platform in some historic levels. My staff was struggling. People were having personal tragedies across their lives. We were scattered. We no longer had a central place to be. And all of those things were coming together at once. And so, but we couldn't fail. Stakes are too high. And so I tried to take on what I could for people during that period and not put additional burden on other folks. I wanted my people to succeed and get through that. Again, I believe leadership eats last. I made sure everybody at the beginning of 2021 took, vacation. I did not until July, in which I, took a couple of weeks off, which was the first time I think I had taken 2 consecutive weeks ever at ActBlue, and I started in 2005. So that was not great in terms of that. And so, feeling the just the drive of all of those things, like everything else. And I think that that's what I've been doing a little bit in my retirement from ActBlue, is trying to reconnect with that balance a little bit at a pace that feels a little bit more sustainable than that one did.
What did that pace cost you?
Well, it was just it was just not sustainable across the board. And that became, I think, a little bit challenging. I was working. I didn't know I could work harder and more hours. And then the pandemic hit and I didn't have to get travel. I could use that time to do things. And I thought, well, that's a sobering thought. I think the challenge with that is that it's not something that had a finish line, because it's not like you got through that election and that crisis, and then things immediately snapped back. We still lived through the pandemic in 2021 and 2022. And our world was changing and needed new things to be part of that. And the organization was changing at a different place. And I just felt like I did not have the stamina for that at that point in time. I felt that burnout and I got sick, which, is not the greatest, but that is a forcing factor, and forced me to take some time off. And, the kind of sickness that I couldn't avoid at any place, but it was, working at that pace was certainly not helpful towards that.
Yeah. How did you, as a leader of ActBlue, how did you determine for yourself what enough was?
In terms of still being the leader?
Right. Or even before deciding, the leadership change, but what's enough, right? Because one of the powerful pieces that's coming through from our conversation, again, is this deep responsibility, this deep commitment to excellence. Many times that we couldn't fail. We could not fail. And that's an extraordinary high bar. That's like in entrepreneurship, right? The definition is risk, that there might be failure, right? But you're in entrepreneurship, you're leading, and you've said multiple times, I couldn't fail. I couldn't let my team down. I couldn't let democracy democracy. Couldn't let democracy down. So how did you define for yourself what was enough?
I think like most folks who feel responsibility to other folks, it was when the folks on my team needed different things from me. And when they said things like, we can't keep your pace. You haven't taken a day off and you're telling us we should. And that was a bit of a double-edged sword, because I do think that people talk a lot about self-care and it gets weaponized a little bit. Like, you need to have self-care. And it's like, oh, okay, I'll add that onto my list of things to do. Is that something I'm failing at as well as these other things? And so I certainly felt conflict with that. But, I think that was, I would certainly get that feedback from folks about ways that they were struggling, and like thinking about how our organizational environment needed to make more space and how I could demonstrate that and try to make that happen, which is, I guess, a way of that responsibility kind of working on there. But ultimately, I think that was a large part of why I decided to step down. When I decided to step down was because the work needed it. Because we, had come out of this period of all of this growth, come out of the 2020 election, and organizationally in our lifetime, it was clear we were going to have to start making some different decisions. We weren't going to be in that stage of doubling every election cycle again. So then the work problem becomes different. How do you build something for the long haul? What does this look like? What does the next decade look like? How do you make this sustainable? What kind of expertise do we need there? We had grown up a lot. I was involved in this project of trying to really grow our management class across the organization, something I wish I always had aspirations of starting earlier, to really be able to kind of support and make sure other folks felt a strong stake in the organization. And the political work, we had Trump looming again. We lost Roe v. Wade. Now we're in a different environment with technology. It's not a world. Now we all have computers, soon implanted in our bodies. What does that mean for what people are going to need? How do we continue to make sure that we're living up to those principles and making it easy for people to participate in these changing environments? And to me, those seemed like that's the work of the next strategy. That's the next 10 years of what we have to do in the organization. That was very clear to me. And I didn't feel like I had 10 years. I'd already been there for 17. I didn't need to. I was just running that entire time. I'm very proud and very glad of what we were able to create during there. But I wasn't not interested in those problems. I did not care about those problems. I did not have opinions about those problems. But I felt very strongly that I didn't want to start putting things in place based on what I would do if I wasn't going to see it through. And I did not feel like, I think 30 years at one organization would have been a lot for anyone. And I think probably just not healthy for any organization to have folks who are around for such a long time. But for me, I think that was really what was key to my thinking of why now is the right time to go, because the work was going to demand something different. I think I had been successful at the project I had done so far. And that, I didn't want to put my thumb on the scale for what came next, because I cared so much about this organization and the work that we did. And that requires creativity and freedom. I had a lot of that creativity and freedom in those early stages to be able to figure out what worked. I wanted to make sure somebody else had options for what they were going to do to lead going forward.
So we often say that deciding is the hardest part, right? Mm-hmm. And so you decided, okay, it's time. Mm-hmm. So then what did that mean for you? What happened next? What happened next?
Figuring out the how is pretty challenging. It had always been in my mind, and again, learning from other organizations at scale, learning where all these things got in. Succession planning is something people talk about, and something I always tried to do some parts of, and I had laid some groundwork for over the years, but we didn't have the mechanics for what we were going to do on that point. And the work doesn't stop. We were still in the middle of the 2022 midterm election cycle, which was hard. That was a grind. The pandemic was still happening. Traditionally, midterm elections are tough for incumbent parties. We were still growing the organization. And so I knew that I was going to have to, it felt responsible to keep the organization, to try to keep things running through the 2022 election. It felt responsible to plan my exit around that period so that the new person could be around, because I had a feeling some important things were going to happen around the 2024 election. And it turns out the team at ActBlue, they're killing it. And their work has been very important to the 2024 election. And so it was going to be important that a new leader could really hit the ground running with that time frame. And so it became an additional project I took on, like how to help like get this ready. I was very clear that like this was not my decision and my process to run, because I think we've all seen people who have been leaders at organizations, especially people who have been there as long as I was there, who hang around, who haunt what's happening in those organizations, who don't know when it is time to go, and then don't step off the playing field and they encumber something else. And I was determined not to be a person like that. And so one of the things that I had done to kind of set up for the succession early on was I had changed my board seat around to make sure that it belonged to whoever was leading the organization, and that, you know, it was not just going to be for me in perpetuity. That seems like I think that would have been arrangeable if I wanted to, but that seemed like a really bad example to be able to lead. And so tried to keep the wheels running on the work that we were doing, tried to keep the organizational building process. We'd been doing all this foundational work after 2020, trying to really build up our managers. We were trying to, you know, figure out what are the tenets, what are the internal parts of the work that we're doing. Wanted to keep that going we were working on strategic planning. I wanted to keep building on that momentum so that hopefully our next leader could have options, could have things in their possibility so that the team could have some strength and some pillars beneath them to try to help make that easier when that transition happened. I had good intentions, but I think what ended up happening was it was another project on top of things that I was already really busy on. And so I don't know, I felt like I did any of those things well across the board. But, but we hadn't had a leadership transition. We had some early ones in our early days, but not for over a decade. And so, I think we had to create a bunch of new things in that moment. And so I hope it will go easier for them for future leadership transitions to be able to figure that out.
And what was that like for you, the official handoff, the official baton pass, so to speak? What was that day like? Paint a picture for us.
It didn't happen in like one day. There wasn't an official kind of trade-off. That's not how the timing worked around things. And it was more, I think, like a crescendo of activity and then kind of a slow fading away. We had the election in 2022, building towards that and getting the team through that, and kind of the end of the year. When I announced I was leaving, that I was leaving at the end of the year because I think it was just important for us all to have a deadline for that. But the new person didn't come on board until later in January. And so I, said my goodbyes at the end of December, but the work continued. Curveballs kept coming up. Other work was kind of necessary. And we were still all remote. So kind of, said goodbye to everybody at the end of December. And then I tried to do things in January. I wanted to be available and be helpful, to help, the new person to answer questions, but also not, put my finger on the scale too much, not have her have to hear too much of my take on things. She was going to have to build her own. And so I think neither of us knew how that would look. And so there were lots of things in the first few weeks. And then, she had to go work with the new team and they had to figure out those things. And so, I had to step back. There were some things that kept coming up. There were some organizational problems. And I was like, I feel like I should help. I don't want to leave this to you guys. And they're like, it's not your problem anymore. We got to go figure it out. And I tried to put in place that I knew logically that that's what was going to have to happen because that's a responsible thing to happen. And so I tried to set all of that up, and I knew I'd be a little bummed when it did happen. And, when they announced the next person to the organization, they asked me to be part of her video package, introducing her to folks. So I was glad to do that. And then, they went off to the races, which is great. I will still pick up the phone if they ever have questions, if they ever need things. But, and I'm cheerleading for them. I'm so proud of the work that they have done, especially over the past couple of months. But I think, I hope that that's a good model that I'm setting for kind of the future, that, I cared about it a lot and I want it to continue. And for it to continue, it needs to be different, and they need space for that to happen.
And in the space between what is one of the most courageous things a leader can do, right, is we spend a lot of time on the starts. We don't talk a lot about the end. And that's a difficult thing to do. And you've talked about it a little bit, and I've talked about it with almost every leader I've talked to on this podcast about, I saw some example of someone who did it like this, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
I don't want to do that. But what does seem to be challenging is sort of like you said, you can know that that's the right thing. You can do it and do all the steps, and it's the space and the quiet that's after, right, that can sometimes be hard. And so I wonder, what happened next? So you were done. It's not my bag to carry anymore. What did you do next?
Well, the plan was to do nothing for a little bit of time. But that's not the way life goes. I had some personal things come up. I had a huge house construction project that ended up having to happen because, sometimes the weather happens. And some folks who had been through this kind of transition before were really kind to me. I had some folks who said, we're going to keep our meetings. We're going to keep checking in over the next couple of months, because I think that's just an important thing to do. And I tried to catch up on things that I hadn't been doing before. Took my mom to Paris, and, tried to show up for the folks in my life in ways that were helpful, and tried to start thinking about, give myself a little space to think about what might be the next thing that kind of comes on there. And, yeah.
If you were to talk to, let's say, 20-something-year-old Erin for the first couple of years of ActBlue, and you could sit with her on a couch or wherever you like to sit, you could sit next to her, what would you tell her?
That it's going to work. This is worthwhile, and that it will be useful for folks, and useful for our democracy. I would, everybody has hindsight across the board. I would have prioritized internal building sooner across the organization. I would have prioritized I had always aspirations for trying to support kind of managers across the board and stuff. I would have tried to make that transition a little bit earlier and being able to kind of support them, because I think that that is not putting too much on them. That is helping people step into their power and step into their possibility across the board. And I think that was something that I just frequently got set to the side because of the growth and the pace that we had on the board. But that I hope it's been worthwhile and important. And I hope 20-year-old Erin would find that gratifying to know.
And what would you tell yourself if you could sit down with, the Erin who was sprinting with growth? Like growth is like this engine, like you said, that just, it never ends. It never takes a break. Right. And if you could sit with her, take a walk with her during any point of that 10-year race, what would you say to her?
I think I always wondered when it would be time to move on, and where that would come. And I think I always just assumed I would feel finished at some point. That, we would finish a project. We would win an election. We'd raise $1 billion. We'd raise $10 billion. We'd help 10 million people and stuff. And then I would feel like I have done my part and that work has happened. And that's just not the way things come together. I think one, if you're an ambitious person, and like you said, growth, like we worked in politics, there's always another election. The stakes are always really high. And if you're an interested, organized, driven person, there's always another mountain. There's always something else to go forward with that. And so I think that was one of the things that was challenging for me. Like, when I left, I'm not sure I felt finished. There were still problems. There were new curveballs that were coming on. How could I help them with those things? They're going to have to deal with all of that. There's another election. But I think, like I said, for me, what ended up being really critical to my decision-making was that the work needed another 10-year project. And that was just not the timeline that I had space for. And so I think I would tell myself that, like, you're never going to feel finished. There is no finish line. And so it's about what are all those other circumstances there. The work, was finished at any given point. And the important part of its sustainability is the legacy that comes behind, and the fact that there's something that new people can go and carry forward. That's success. And that's what that means there. But I think I assumed it would feel more resolved. And that's not exactly how it felt. It felt more like it was just, that is the right next thing to do. That is the right next strategy to do. Less than like, okay, well, let's put together. But that's good, because now it's living on. It's doing things for other people. It shouldn't be resolved. It's a new, it was an exciting problem then. It's an exciting problem now for people to keep working on. And that's great.
So for those who are listening, I mean, you probably get a lot of calls like this. I get a lot of calls like this from people who are early in their career, right? Mm-hmm. They're like a 20-something-year-old Erin. And they're like, I believe deeply that our world needs to be different. And I think that I can contribute to politics in some sort of meaningful way. What can you offer them, right? What can you offer them about how they might want to consider or think about the steps that they might take to have the kind of contribution that you've had?
The first thing that I offer folks, which I think sometimes feels like cold water, is that you've got to think about what you're interested in intellectually, what kind of work that you like. I think especially over the years with people coming in from different industries into the work that we did, I think people would be like, this is going to save my soul. We're going to change the world. And it's like, no, not exactly. It's great. It's wonderful. And we're so grateful to be able to do work that has this impact and be able to put that together. But it's work. And it's a workplace like all other workplaces. And the story of the work that we did, the environment, the industry we worked in is this industry that is helping to make things. But it's still work problems. The scaling problems we had are the same work problems that everybody else has. And so I think the first thing is thinking about, like, what's your vocation? Like, what do you like to do? What is your talent? Are you a writer? Are you, great with technology? Are you a speaker? Are you a leader? Like, what is your skill set? And what interests you about that kind of work? And then think about how to build a profession and a career around that in this industry. What kind of jobs work around that space? And where's their need? Where's there a space for that work to happen? Because I think oftentimes too many folks kind of jump into the first thing, like, you want to run for office? That's great. Here are the steps. Here's the mechanics of that. This is what it looks like on a day-to-day basis. Is that the thing that works for you? Or do you want to work in advocacy somewhere? Or do you want to work in legislation somewhere? There's a lot of different paths to that. And I think it's important to connect that drive with what your skill set is and what you're interested in, because that's how you build a career. That's how it becomes long-term.
As you think about this next chapter, mm-hmm. How are you thinking about it? And what lessons from the previous chapter do you hope you'll carry forward? Yeah,
I feel very open. I feel very open to new things. And I think I'm really lucky because the work that I did at ActBlue actually touched a whole lot of different spaces and a lot of industry. I care very much about making sure we live in a great environment and advocating for things I believe in. That doesn't have to be my job on a regular basis. I do that on a daily basis still in my community. That comes down to, helping the people around me and trying to support my community. I'm always going to do that. But I'm really interested in puzzles. I'm really interested in, I got to learn so much about technology and organization development and leadership and strategic management and financial sector and doing good customer service in the work that I did, that I feel like I'm interested in using that history and applying it to another interesting puzzle in whatever industry or space that might come into. I like working with folks in a team. That's one thing that I miss the most about not being part of a team right now, being able to work with other smart people towards a common goal and being able to achieve something. And so I would like that. And I was so lucky. I got to learn so much during my work at ActBlue. Sometimes it felt like a crash course, but I am curious about learning a new workplace and getting to learn new skills within that new workplace. And so kind of interested in possibility of what could come next and how to use the experience that I've had building strategy and growing something from something small to something that turned out to be a true force for good in our country, but also just a successful business. And being able to apply those skills to a new problem area and a new set of puzzles and a new bunch of collaborators.
Yeah. Erin, if I like to give, I want to give you the final word. Sure. Before I do that, though, I want to sort of lift up what is just been a really powerful conversation, for me as a host. I mean, I've already touched on one, which is just this incredibly deep sense of responsibility for other humans. This also, second thing is this, what seems like an almost like insatiable appetite for taking on big problems. And I think third, fearless gets thrown around a lot, but that's how I experienced it, was sort of a fearlessness around answering big questions. Like this is an important, like a question identification. This is a question that is worthy of solving. So like I am solving a worthy question, but then also like, I don't actually know the answer. But I'm pretty confident that with the right team of people, we can figure this out. Right. And that seems to be the consistent, the theme that I just sort of want to lift up and like, play back for you. And then a couple of other things that have really struck me in this conversation are this leadership tension that I think a lot of leaders experience, which is I need to lead by example, and also leaders eat last. Right. So there's tension in that. Right. Mm-hmm. And sort of seeing that play out. And then I think the final thing is this a question mark that I'm being left with, which is when you are a leader that is as ambitious and as responsible and as people driven as you are, and you stand in the gap for everyone else, the question I'm left with is like, who does it for you?
Well, that was a lot of thinking, and you said very kind things. So thank you very much, Evie. And I really appreciated the conversation. You're always such a great person to talk through and ruminate on all of these big things with. And I'm interested to hear about your conversations with other folks and to learn from them. I feel like my experience was both just circumstantial to, the circumstances of the job and the environment that I was in. But I think a lot of it is just also the universal things of, what happens when things get bigger and how do you evolve with that? I think it's important to always be connected to the people around you and to the people that you're working for. I think that's a good place to have that drive. I think as the organization scale, though, I think part of that responsibility to folks is also giving them space for them to grow, letting them go through their own problems and having them go and have to have that struggle. And I think that was a really important thing to learn in our scaling journey of how to be able to, right, how do you lead leaders? And that was my last few years at ActBlue. I think that was really exciting and gratifying. A lot of those folks are still leading and flourishing there right now. I'm so proud of them. And I'm glad I played a small role in their story and their ambition and their be able to be that growth. And so I hope that's not very unique. I hope people feel connected and responsible to each other. I think that to me, that feels like a core part of leadership. It's about how you interact with other folks and how you're helping to take on problems. So I hope that's not unusual. But I think, I think we also live at this really exciting time. So much of, excuse me, I'm like falling. I think so much of what I was able to do was just luck. Being able to kind of come into the work in industry at this time when we were on the cusp of change. The laws were changing. Technology was changing. What we needed in our democracy was changing. What was possible was changing. And being able to figure out how to harness that. And I don't know what will be next, but I think we're living in this time where we're all connected. We have seen that in acute and large ways over the past few years. And we all have these abilities to be in each other's lives. You can write on social media. You can hear people. We are all screaming all of the time in this world. And so I think it's all of our duties to think about what are the big questions? How do we navigate that? But also, how do we do that in community with each other? How do we do that in ways that lift each other up? How do we do that understanding that we all come from different experiences? Because I think that's just modern life. I think we are all living together, and that is the wonder of being more connected, having the world feel like it's shrinking. And also, I think all of our challenge and responsibility to kind of figure out. And so I think that's also, I don't know what the next 10 years are going to bring for new opportunities. I think we see challenges already, but so much more possibility of what we can all achieve now as we think about technology, as we think about our workspace, as we think about what we're demanding and of each other and what we want to provide to each other. And so I'm excited to be a part of whatever comes next in this world. And I'm excited that there are lots of leaders, I think, who are stepping into their power and finding ways to interact with our world as it both demands and as is possible. And so I did this work because I was inspired by it and interested in it. And I'm looking to find something next that I will be both inspired and interested in, because I think it's those two things that are important.
Yeah. Where can people find you?
I am a very avid consumer of social media. I am less of a participant in social media. That's okay. I am on, you can find me on LinkedIn. I am at Erin Hill on Twitter. I am at Erin Marie Hill on Instagram and all of those places. But I can be connected to in those places. I'm not frequently pontificating on those places.
Thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you so much, Evie. It was so nice to talk with you.
Yeah, no, it was really a pleasure. I'm just really moved.
I went to college at Wellesley, so lots of women there, and had worked, in my early jobs in politics, a lot of women leaders worked under them in the fundraising world. So coming into working at ActBlue, I was the only woman in the first couple of years in working with lots of different men in the tech space. So that was just difference for me, figuring out how to earn trust and how to communicate a little bit differently, right? Part of that and the need of being able to bring in expert talent is be able to create a work environment that people want to be part of in order to do that. So I had to kind of learn entirely new vocabulary. But I was growing up, I was precocious. My parents let me do all sorts of things. So it never really occurred to me that I should think about, I never really felt all of my gender identity in all of those early days. But the thing that I think made me think about it the most was having women who worked for me and hearing how important it was to have women who worked for me. So I was the only woman at ActBlue for a number of years. When I left ActBlue, more than 50% of the organization identified as women. And I am proud of that. I am proud of that. I am proud of the fact that we were able to bring in lots of new voices, lots of younger people, lots of folks who identify as people of color across the organization, and then try to build a community of that internally. But I would hear oftentimes from the younger women who worked for me, when they left, they would talk about how important it was to work for a woman. They would talk about watching my example, and that made me think about that work and that responsibility as a role model in a different way, and think about what I owed them to be able to see. One time I was getting interviewed by a reporter from the New York Times. Pretty big moment in my professional career, big moment for our organization. And we're taking a tour of the office, and I was talking about some of the technology stats and taking the interview in tandem with a male coworker of mine. We had plotted it out that way. He was talking about the technology, and we were talking about this board that we had lots of stats on. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, you understand the stats too?" And I said, "Yeah, I kind of run this technology company that we're moving billions of dollars through." And my coworker who was doing the interview was like, "She's my boss." And the guy was like, "Oh yeah. I didn't think you really understood the technology part. You just seem so good at talking about the stories." And I was like, "Well, yeah, but I do the work too." And so, pulled it back. We had the rest of the interview and we left. But I felt a certain way about that conversation and the way that went. But it happened in the middle of my office, in an open office that we had. So by the time I got back to my desk, all the staff had heard about that, and particularly the women in my office were like, "Oh my goodness, you would not believe the way this reporter just disrespected Erin, and Erin corrupted him across the board." And I thought, well, this is one of those strange moments of leadership, to think about what it is I had originally just been thinking about how I felt about that personal moment, to be giving this interview and have somebody say that, and then whether or not I could trust him to be able to tell our story in a way that felt accurate if he's going to say that. But then I thought, like, oh, I'm glad I had a good response to that, because it's my job to show up in that way. So hopefully that doesn't happen to some of these younger women who are working on my team when they're giving those interviews and they get those conversations across the board. And so I think the thing that made me think about what it was like to work as a woman in tech, and to be able to be a woman leader, was having women who were working under me and thinking about my responsibility to be a good example to them, and think about how to be able to hopefully pave the world forward a little bit forward for them.